Hello all, I'm Kel Kivman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today the Democrats and particularly CNN are pushing stimulus. Well, that being despite the fact that a stimulus bill, or as I like to call it, a pork debt bill, just passed with the support of President Biden. You see, there has been a lot of push for much of the stimulus sort of narrative, even from people on the right, with many people on the right complaining that there isn't enough stimulus, that there isn't enough money going out, where they are all forgetting one simple thing, a simple phenomenon that should not be forgotten by anyone. The fact of the matter is, once a democracy is starting to vote itself money in perpetuity, it is no longer on the path of success, but rather on the path of destruction. Because at that point where you become, rather than people who are seeking out your own wealth, you are rather seeking out each other's wealth. It gets to the point where people are no longer attempting to gain wealth or gain new skills or improve themselves in any way, but are rather trying to get as much money out of government as possible. They become leeches. And that is what has happened most clearly with this last election, assuming it was completely legitimate, which I'm not going to talk about here. But of course, it has continued to be pushed, with CNN particularly saying that, oh, we're going to get a next one, and they're already pushing the next one, despite the fact that COVID's kind of on the downswing. But of course, this isn't the only thing that Democrats are pushing. They're also pushing minimum wage. Despite the fact that 8 Democrats voted it down in this most recent vote, we're still getting pushes from even people like Senator Joe Manchin, saying that him particularly saying that every senator thinks the minimum wage should be increased. Now, anyone who knows anything about a few particular people in the Senate, like, I don't know, Rand Paul, knows that this is a completely absurd statement. Rand Paul doesn't even really believe in the minimum wage. He's a libertarian dude. You really think that 100 out of 100 are going to be supportive of raising the minimum wage, despite the fact that the minimum wage is an inherently destructive policy when it comes to particularly jobs and the like, and upward mobility, by the way? Because here's the thing. The minimum wage has been made, at this point, has been made by many men, including more traditional establishment types like Ben Shapiro. I don't think he's fully establishment, but that's beside the point. Have made this point. The actual minimum wage, no matter what you're talking about, is 0. Because here's the thing. The lowest wage you can have is no wage. And you're never going to solve that through rising minimum wages. You're never going to solve that in any way other than presumably a federal jobs guarantee, which is not going to work because here's the thing. Federal jobs guarantees inevitably create fake jobs. They're not real. They don't have any upward mobility. You're not going anywhere in them. But they exist to do one simple thing. Give people a wage and to make the government statistics look better than they ever have. That's why they exist. And that's why this sort of thing is happening. And, there's a lot of turmoil, even in the Democratic Party about this, particularly with $15 an hour, with many moderate Democrats voting against it. Partially, I would say, because it's a safe vote and no one really supports it. But that's neither here nor there. But, of course, this isn't the only thing causing turmoil within the Democrats, because the Cuomo scandal is still continuing. And Cuomo, specifically, has actually sort of denied it. Well, denied the scandal's endgame, where he is saying he will not resign. Now, I kind of expected this. I don't think that Cuomo's the type of guy to lay down and take it with this sort of thing, though he has in certain respects. But I think that this particular example is both a good and bad thing, particularly for the Democrats. For me, I just like to see the sort of Democrats burn under their own hubris. But in this case, it's really bad for the Democrats. Because what this scandal, and this is all about the sexual harassment scandals, of course, and there has been 2 more people who have come out over the weekend to accuse him of more sexual harassment, inappropriate things going on and whatnot. That sort of thing has been happening. And there have been continuing allegations of, frankly, kind of inane conduct. Not things that I would call good, or would personally do myself, certainly, but things that I would say are not necessarily worth firing, maybe worth a scolding. Well, in certain cases, certainly worth a scolding, assuming that it's true, and sometimes worth a firing, but nothing on the sort of level that you'd expect to precipitate this sort of scandal and continuous news coverage. You can't get away from this story. And that is because this is a cover-up. This is a cover-up by the Democrats of Cuomo's actual scandal, and of course this isn't a unique point, but it's worth it to mention, and it needs to be said all over again, because this needs to be drilled into everyone's heads. They're hiding the granny scandal. They're hiding the fact that Cuomo was putting people, old folks, into old folks' homes when they had COVID, and thus killing many a grandma, about 9,000 as of what we know. It could be much higher because, hey, they've been lying to us before. Why do we believe them now, especially when an investigation has not been done as of yet? It doesn't seem as though there will be in full. Though that might change, because Cuomo refusing to resign in this case actually opens himself up to more scandals coming out. With this particular scandal, if it does end up getting investigated more often and we have some sort of bombshell, another bombshell on top of all the other bombshells that have happened throughout this process, it may just take him down through something like a referendum or impeachment. But you have to ask the question at that point, why are the Democrats so invested about keeping this sort of thing under wraps? Why are they so invested on making sure no one knows about the failures of Cuomo's policy? Well, it's simple, guys. They don't want you to know about the failures of Cuomo because they don't want you to know about the failures of Democrats generally. They don't want you to know about every single failing that their policy has had, and this isn't the only example of such, because there has been a lot of pushback against the reopenings that many red states have been doing. Particularly Mississippi and Texas, especially because they're the most populous state, with even Fauci jumping on at this point. And it's worth it to mention here, he is now wearing 2 masks regularly, this being despite the fact that he started by being on the subject, saying, well, it makes sense, common sense, that double masks would work better than a single mask, because whatever, to being ambivalent on the subject, simply saying that there is no evidence that it would work, to now wearing it constantly without even acknowledging the flip-flop that he's done over all of around a 3-week period or so. This sort of thing has been happening a lot, and with regard to Democratic policy is actually quite telling, because there are certain statements that are made within even this particular Guardian article that show very clearly exactly how the Democrats and the Republicans have changed, and in the case of the Republicans, particularly how they have not changed. Because the Republicans continue to say what has been said over the past year, that they were only doing this so that they could take pressure off of their health system. They didn't want the health system to be overrun and then have a whole lot of problems. Now, of course, do I think that is the entire reason that the lockdown stayed and the mask mandate stayed the entire way through? No, of course not. This is all sort of performative. But removing it at this point before we are fully vaccinated is certainly a sign of their kind of motive. You know, what they actually want to do to a certain extent, that's kind of what I think their headspace is at. Or at least that's how I see it. Whereas Democrats have gone from 2 weeks to slow the spread to COVID 0 or no openings whatsoever. That's what it's gone to. And this isn't supported by the evidence, because the mask narrative, the pro-mask, oh, it works, it is so good, it stops the disease entirely, that sort of narrative, a bit exaggerated on my part, has fallen apart. Because the exact same type of study that I have been pushing for months at this point has finally come out with a data analysis of the entire country of the United States with all of the sort of mask and other such policies taken into account. And then they're analyzing that and seeing the actual effect of a mask mandate rather than trying to guess at it with models. And what has happened in this case? Well, the actual data they show that masks lower the spread by 1.5%. Now, you might say, oh, that's disproving your point, because you see, it has lowered the spread. And, that's not to mention that that is actually within the statistical margin of error, and thus could be completely inflated, and simply it could be zero in actuality. But think of it this way, and flip the polarities for a bit. All right, let's not think about the 1.5% decrease. Let's talk about how many cases were actually not stopped by the mask. In this case, being at most, because as we've established, this could be statistical error, 98.5%. 98.5% of cases were not stopped by masks. You have a 1.5% success rate. Now, is that worth going through? Is that worth mandating? No, of course not. But they're still going to push it. And in this particular study itself, in the conclusions area, of course, where all of the bias of the scientists is supposed to come out, it has shown this very well, with them continuing to recommend mask mandates because it lowered it at all. Now, as you can imagine, there's a whole lot of problems with this. Because here's the thing. My assessment of how effective masks could be is infinitely more accurate than the credentialed, scholared scientists that were pushing the pro-mask agenda the entire time, with the German study, which I've covered a number of times, claiming initially that masks were lowering the case rate by 45%. Now, as I've already mentioned, that is a huge difference. That is a huge difference. And how do you get that sort of difference? Is it compliance? No. Is it any sort of thing that could be, reasonably explained through actual science? No. The difference is that the Germany study is a model. It is not scientific. It doesn't represent anything that actually happened in the natural world, and only represents the biases of the scientists who created it. And in this case, I have been fundamentally vindicated, because they're off by something like, 30 times, whereas I'm only off by about a single percentage point at most. Even despite, that's to take the least charitable position of mine, where I have said in the past that it may be marginally effective. I have said that in the past, and though, even if you are to take the most unfavorable position of mine, it's still not off by much, is it? And that is, once again, to assume that this is not statistical anomaly, that this isn't statistical error, and that they aren't rounding up, which it seems to be that it is. And this truly reveals, particularly within the conclusion section of this study, why the scientists operate this way. Because what these scientists are pushing is particular policy. They are there to make politicians look good. They are hired by politicians, in fact. That's what grant money is. You're paying the scientists to give you something you want in the case of politicians. And in the case of politicians who are pushing mask mandates, they're looking for studies that support mask mandates. So that's what they're going to get, because they're paying them to get that. That's how money works. That's what you should expect, in fact. But this, despite my problems with the conclusion, is a good study, and is something I will rely on to debunk, sort of, these pro-mask claims, because of the methodology. The methodology is good. The methodology is actually based in science and statistical analysis, and isn't based in nonsense. It isn't based in pseudoscience. And that's why I trust it. That's why I'm bringing it up. But this has completely destroyed the mask narrative. Utterly decimated it. Of course, we shouldn't allow these sort of domestic issues to cloud our judgment and prevent ourselves from seeing the more worldwide perspective. Because there are things that are occurring on the foreign policy angle, with certain things happening, particularly in Iraq, where the U.S. is saying that the Biden administration saying particularly that it will do what is necessary to protect its troops at Iraqi air bases. Now, what has occurred specifically is that an Iraqi air base was that has American soldiers in it, was attacked with a missile, and it is assumed at this point that it was done by Iran, because the sort of character matches up. It's sort of the profile thing. And this comes at the, sort of precipice of the beginning of the breakdown, essentially, of Middle Eastern foreign politics. A lot of things have happened, if you haven't noticed, over the past few weeks, with Biden bombing Syria, and now this. We're going to probably see over the next few weeks and months a few more things happen, because a lot of things are breaking down. Now, some people are probably going to blame this on Trump. They're going to say, well, look at what happened in January of 2020, where Trump killed Soleimani, and look at what happened after that. They also bombed an air base. Of course, the difference being that, first of all, that was provoked, and second of all, they announced it to the Iraqis before it happened, and everyone was gone by the time the missiles actually arrived. See, and at that point, everyone on the internet was claiming, well, it's World War III, it's going to happen, World War III. All of this panic was happening. But of course it wasn't going to happen, and anyone with eyes could have seen at the time it's not going to happen. But now, when there seemingly is nothing that could possibly aggress them against Biden, except maybe the strikes against Syria and sort of the anise that Biden has been on returning to the Iran deal, because they've been wanting to get, Iran has wanted to get a lot of stuff out of them, concessions and such, where Biden has seemed somewhat reluctant to give it. And that's sort of where we're at. But I think this has to do more with Biden's ineptitude as a leader. That's what it looks like to me. In this case, it seems to me that the Middle East is kind of going to break down. I don't know if the gains that have been made during the Trump administration will retain themselves. I don't know if the Abraham Accords will continue existing, in other words. They may not. I have no idea at this point, and I'm not going to guess, because that's sort of not my style in these sorts of cases, because I'm not a huge foreign policy wonk. But I do suspect that something is going to happen. And I do suspect that Joe Biden will find an excuse to start a war. It's seeming like it's going in that direction. Iran has already attacked us, so it may be against Iran. That may be the case. It may be against Syria or any other number of countries that have been rising tensions against us in the last month since Biden has been in office. Though I suspect that some people will blame this war on Trump, particularly if it's against Iran. They may say that, well, Trump was rising tensions against Iran all throughout his presidency. He was antagonizing them and such. Well, I'm going to stop that out a bit preemptively, because I don't think this has anything to do with Trump. No matter what sort of war happens, even if it is with Iran, and even if the Iranian government claims it's because of things that Trump did, I don't think it's going to have anything to do with Trump. The reason being is that it never happened while Trump was in government. While Trump was in government, there were peace deals being signed, and seemingly no tensions. Well, there was tension, but there weren't actual attacks, or much less attacks, while Trump was president. To me, it seems that they're trying to exploit the weakness of Biden as a leader. And they're trying to exploit the fact that the Congress is actually seriously considering, not just by Republicans, but also by Democrats, removing Biden's war powers, which, oh boy, if that isn't supposed to convince us that he has dementia, I don't know what is. But that seems where we're going to be at, and that's probably what's going to happen over the next few months. Of course, I don't think I'm Nostradamus or anything like that, and I'm not expecting to completely predict everything. I just think I'm looking at sort of what's happening and predicting forward, and what is fairly, basic and obvious. This sort of thing tends to happen before these sorts of conflicts, most of the time anyway. So I that's kind of what I expect to happen. And that's where I'm going to leave us off. Wherever you are, though, subscribe. If you made it to the end of this video, I hope you enjoyed it. But if you're on YouTube, go anywhere else. I mean, there's a whole lot of pretty links down in the description. I suggest you go look at them. They're very pretty. They're very good, and they have lots of good stuff. And if you go into places like Gab or Minds or Parler, you might check out some of my thoughts, particularly on Minds, where I really do like to post there, at least when I remember to. But that's where we're at, And I'm Kel Kidman. This has been Breaking Out the Daily, and I'm out.